Monika Bielskyte is part of a new wave of thinkers who are redefining the practice of thinking about the future. As she puts it, mainstream futurist thinkers tend to extrapolate from the prevailing status quo and propose singular, predetermined future scenarios. With the Protopia framework, Monika and others see a vast scope of alternative futures which we can choose to bring about through imagination and innovation. Spending time with Monika was fascinating, and we hope to have her return to pick up the conversation in the coming season.
Hello, and welcome to The Evolving Leader. I'm Scott Allender.
And I'm John Gomes.
How are you feeling today, John?
I am feeling very excited. I am desperate to talk to our guest. I had a chat with her a few weeks ago, and it was the time ran away, and unfortunately we don't have the same amount of time today, but it's going to be a great show, so I'm feeling great. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling similar. I'm really grateful to be in this present moment with you today, where we will spend a great deal of our time talking about the future, because today we are joined by Monika Bielskyte. Monika is a futurist and founder of Protopia Futures, a collaborative research and creative platform which challenges dystopian and utopian binary stereotypes and seeks to offer more hopeful visions of the future. Folks, you're definitely going to want to lean into this conversation we're about to have with Monika, because from everything I've read and watched that she's done, there is a depth of richness that demands our engagement. To draw you in a little bit about where we're going today, Monika believes that technological innovation without humanitarian evolution always leads to dystopian futures. We'll be jumping off this premise for our time with her today. So Monika, we are delighted that you are here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to share this virtual space with y'all, and of course with the audience.
Monika, welcome to The Evolving Leader. We met a few years ago where we were both keynote speakers, and I was really intrigued by your approach, which is very different to many of the people and organizations I've come to work in the area that you're in, although I think you work in a kind of rarefied environment. But before we get into that, can we talk a little bit about your life? Because it really forms the basis of your worldview and thinking. Starting, I guess, with the fact that you were born at a very significant moment and location and time.
Yeah. Wow. I had quite a bit of a adventurous life, for better or worse. I was born in a country that doesn't exist anymore, which is Soviet Union, then became Lithuania. And I really came of age at that moment of the collapse of the physical wall, the Iron Curtain, as well as the opening up of the digital world. So a lot of the things that people in the so-called Western world take for granted, such as liberty of movement, such as, just kind of talking how social media had made things worse. I have a bit of a different perception, because to be able to see, a truly oppressive authoritarian regime actually collapse under its own weight makes you think that nothing is ever inevitable and nothing is ever impossible. And I think the different paths that some of the former Soviet Union countries have gone, and the paths that, let's say, Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine have gone, and the reality they're dealing with today, also makes me think that we cannot take anything ever for granted, as well as, Putin's very open stance about the fact that he considers that the collapse of the Soviet Union and the liberation of the so-called Soviet republics was the greatest mistake, and that he ideally would like us all to return to the motherland. Makes you think that, well, you never know, when place that I'm here right now could become the next Crimea. So the notion of sort of never taking the liberty of movement for granted is something very, very important in my life, and which led me to travel the world and really leave my house and go to all kinds of places way beyond just sort of, again, global north type of tourist destinations, 90, almost 100 countries right now and counting, because I never know when I would not be able to do that ever again, because that was my family's history, right? And then another thing, to be really part of those first non-exclusive Western university-based sort of digital networks as the only access to be able to relate to people that would feel like community, right? Because in a small town where I was from, with identity that I have, somebody of mixed background, somebody that is queer, I felt incredibly isolated. As well as, not having access to literature that I was interested in, or just sort of anything, right? Like to feel like that's the only way to connect with reality that I was dreaming about, right? So from a very early age, I started dreaming different worlds, and I started trying to connect with different worlds. So as much as I'm incredibly critical of technology and of digital networks and of Western culture, at the same time, I have quite a bit of a different perspective than some of the people that labeled themselves as progressive within the Western world. Right, coming from sort of this history of multiple genocides as well, you really see world events with a bit more acute kind of a perspective.
And something was going on when you were a baby as well, which we should mention.
Yeah, well, I don't speak often about that, but I'm also a Chernobyl baby. So my mother was pregnant with me, and they were just next to the plant when the whole thing exploded, and they were not informed about it. So the fact that I'm here today is already a huge victory for myself, to be able to live in, even if I've dealt with different health issues throughout my life, to know that it was very unsure that I would be able to make it into this world. And also, actually the TV series Chernobyl was directed by a friend of mine, Johan Renck, who did a really quite a good job. It was actually filmed here in Lithuania, where I'm currently. I haven't lived here for more than half of my life. As soon as I could leave, I left, but I keep coming back every summertime for a little moment. And I think he did quite an accurate depiction, how the government corruption throws people under the bus, and how we live through lasting consequences and the granularity of the effect on people's lives. Though still there's a lot of other stuff we could speak about that. And I think Svetlana Alexievich's book, Chernobyl Prayer, could really give your audience incredible insights into, the realities of back then, but continuing into the present day. So I think, a lot of these kind of things, when we talk about genocides, when we talk about disasters, when you talk about things such as, being queer or having mental health issues, potentially sentencing you to death under a totalitarian regime, that's not an abstract notion. That's not a sci-fi novel. That is something that I understand in a very visceral manner. And obviously, a lot of my futures research, I filter through that lens. And that's why also maybe I'm drawn much more to spend time and to collaborate with people from across the global South. In the last few years, I've been mostly spending my time in South Africa, as well as other different parts of the African continent. But there are some really, really interesting parallels between South Africa and what it's living through even today, and kind of a bit of where I'm coming from. Obviously, apartheid was absolutely racialized regime, right? It was, and I think it's a perfect illustration of a utopia for one, utopia, what was labeled as utopia for one tiny group of population, and dystopia for everybody one shade darker than white. right? But the collapse of the apartheid regime in 94, and obviously the collapse of Soviet Union 89 to 91, puts us in quite a similar timeline. So there's a lot of really interesting mutual conversations with my peers there, right? Of what does it mean to be born before that event? What does it mean to be born after? What does it mean to be born on that cusp? And how your life is actually defined by a lot of these things. So how, sometimes in the Western world, people think that, well, age is just a number. And maybe certain generations get defined by, technologies or something like that they've grown up with. But I think in many other parts of the world, generations are also defined by the political strife that they lived or haven't lived through, and hence have certain difficulties to fully relate with, right? And I think these are the things that don't get often discussed in futures and foresight context, which I think is really a shame.
Monika, thank you for sharing a bit about your background. I really appreciate your transparency, and we could spend an entire show, I think, kind of just in any one segment of your experience. But I want to turn to one of your works in particular, where you cite that mainstream futurist thinking tends to extrapolate from the status quo and then propose a singular predetermined future vision, and that the problem with a lot of such foresight is that it is bound by the constraints and suppositions of our dominant perceptions of reality. In other words, we build a future vision bound by our existing values, norms, and worldview, and then this leads to a crisis of imagination. So can you lead us through this problem and into a deeper and better understanding of futurist thinking?
Yeah. Well, actually, I want to speak a little bit about who wrote it, because it wasn't just me. So it's from Protopia Futures Design Framework, which was initiated by me and edited by me, and huge chunks were written by me, yes. But it was really co-written with a phenomenal group of over 30 people that are cited at the end of the document. And the chunk of that specific quote was actually by my, family, friend, peer, collaborator, Rada Mistry, who's another brilliant futures foresight practitioner, currently at Autodesk, and she looks more into architectural futures, right? So I think that's a huge thing as well. For me, anything that I'm doing, it's not so much about my original ideas. Like, I don't claim to be the person that has this original vision of the future, because I think, well, then I might as well be a science fiction author, right? As a foresight practitioner and a futurist, my understanding of the future is really about that knowledge collected from being on the ground, from exchanging with people that are certainly more brilliant than me in many different areas. And it's also about building a community of peers with whom we continuously exchange ideas and we keep contributing to each other's work, which, somebody like Rada, we've been doing that for quite a few years. So I definitely invite everybody to check out Protopia Futures Design Framework. And I think bottom line is that a lot of conversations today about the future focus on technology, right? But it's not technology. It's not some kind of inevitable direction of scientific research that is defining the world that we're going to live in. It is really our culture as human beings. And we've never been rational, and we've never taken a path that is somehow the straightest. And as much as, it's interesting actually to look back into the history of futurism as a word. That's why I always, it's a bit of I'm always at odds with both the industry and even with the framing, right? Because word futurism comes from Futurismo, which is Italian arts movement, deeply entangled with Italian fascism. And from the original Futurist Manifesto, there's literally a quote that speaks about the Danube River and how these futurists were disgusted about it being, windy and circly, and about its muddy waters, and exact quote, fecund with fish. So anything that was in any way considered, associated, I guess, with women especially, and obviously with queerness, disability, etc., was something to be exterminated. Right. So there's also a very deep strand within utopianism as well as with futurism of eugenics. Right? Who do we have to eliminate to reach that future that we want to imagine? Right. So I referred to apartheid in South Africa, but even if we look at Nazi Germany, like Nazi Germany, they had this whole idea about the Umwelt and sort of the Lebensraum for the Germans, and quite a strong environmental vision, but that required exterminating everybody that didn't fit into this idea. And I think a lot of that actually persists in contemporary futurism. There's a deep disregard of anything that is inconvenient to a particular vision that we're trying to promote. Right. So I think now it's become a bit harder with everything that's happened over the pandemic to say that, well, actually, exponential technology is going to solve all the problems. AI is this magic pill. You just swallow it and it's a panacea, and we will understand everything that has gone wrong. And so when people promote this sort of exponential technology that is going to, resolve everything, they conveniently forget to speak about the exponential extinction of language and species facilitated by that. And then when that gets pointed out, then we say, well, we just add more technology. So we're gonna solve the problem created by that thing with more of that thing, rather than actually look at the roots of a lot of these issues and examine, well, maybe the foundations are actually profoundly broken. And generally why these foundations are broken is because they've been designed by a tiny, tiny group of hyper-privileged people within any chosen society. And then they were built by everybody else, by the extracted, oftentimes very much slave labor. Right. And so that's at the root. And how do you build a functional society? How do you build a functional city upon a foundation, whose structures and whose designs you don't want to examine? Right. So, I think a lot about that in my work. And what I'm very, very passionate about is futures literacy. And how do you teach futures literacy is not just teaching about speculative things that might happen. You actually need to teach people about the history of where these things come from. So when we are watching this extraordinary disinformation pandemic accompanying the COVID pandemic, people are really surprised, but it shouldn't be really surprising. Most of the general population doesn't know much about the history of medicine, doesn't know anything about the history of vaccines and the history of the pandemics and different diseases. And even, it seems that in some of the countries, even within biology classes, people still didn't figure out what virus is about if they think that 5G can create a virus. Right. So certain fundamental knowledge is lacking, about media literacy, about the history of the internet, about, having at least a basic scope of how certain technologies function and where do they come from and how they can be abused, et cetera, et cetera. And so when, again, you have such a broken foundation, how do you build anything healthy upon it? And unless we actually resolve these, we start figuring out what is the map of our ignorance and how do we tackle it, it's going to be hard to just move forward.
So beyond the literacy piece, when it comes to the pandemic, I want to pull out something that you've been speaking about, which is that people are dismissive, or even will destroy the thing that runs contrary to the narrative that they hold about the ideal that they want. In my supposition, I see some of that even going on in the pandemic, right? The idea that, I refuse to accept the scientific recommendations, or whether it's mask wearing or something else. In your view, I see that as potentially, but this is just my supposition, I see that as possibly linked to what you're talking about. This notion that I have this idea about what way I want the world to look and what I want to believe about it. This pandemic is inconveniencing that idea. And so I'm going to play by a different set of rules. Do you see that at all? Has that been your experience of kind of some of the pandemic response?
100%. And I think it's very, very multi-layered. I think the reason why, the reasons for why this virus happened and how this pandemic got kicked off are very complex, and we could speak about that, right? Because people are like, oh, it's just one, people always want to find some kind of one magical reason, which certainly does not implicate them, right? So it's like, something from the lab or something from whatever other, magical explanations that are removed from reality. But more than anything, why this has become a global pandemic, especially in the rich countries, is really ableism. And I think we're really not reckoning with that as a society. So I think we're really bad with all of the isms. And I want to sort of pull back to kind of what's happening right now with the whole critical race theory debate. It ultimately started with Nicole Hannah-Jones's Project 1619 of New York Times that re-examined why US is the way it is. Like what is at the roots of the extreme capitalism of the United States of America? What is at the roots of guns ownership? What is at the root of people not having universal healthcare, whereas all of the other so-called rich countries do have that? And it looked back that, well, the root of that is in the slavery. Right. And it was really an extraordinary project that I recommend for everybody to read through. And I think it's being made into a book. But once it was considered to be taught in schools, there was this mass hysteria from a lot of the people in the older generation, less so actually among the young people, but more the parent generation. To push back against that. And I think what it ultimately has, I'm trying to weave a lot of threads, and I hope y'all following me.
Completely.
And I think what it relates to is really that it's very hard for people, especially in positions of power, to imagine a future within which they are obsolete. Right. And it can be very powerful people as politicians, as really wealthy people, but it can also be parents. Right. Because you always have a certain amount of power and privilege upon somebody else. Right. Wherever you situate, even when you think that you don't have power, you don't have privilege, you still might have it upon a certain other group, at the very least towards your children or somebody like that. Right. And I think there's the fear that if these children will get taught the actual history of the United States of America, which is less about American dream, but really about this reality that was built upon the genocide and slavery, that benefited only some and has been dystopia for many for a long time, then the children will start questioning, right? The reality that they live in, the behavior of their parents, the things that they were taught and indoctrinated into, right? Because I think that's another huge thing that we have to remember. To also not be born into bigotry is a privilege in itself, right? So a lot of us are born into a conditioning towards any kind of isms, be it homophobia, xenophobia, racism, misogyny, et cetera, ableism, so on and so forth, right? And it takes an actual effort to kind of unpack that. And things such as teaching the actually sort of non-whitewash history of the United States of America, would actually challenge these very parents. So now they're trying to forbid that because of the kind of stuff that it would result in. So, I think we sort of are starting to reckon a little bit, definitely not enough, with racism, with xenophobia, with homophobia and things like that. However, what I've observed when it comes to ableism throughout this pandemic, even coming from people who, again, would think of themselves as very progressive, very liberal, et cetera, on so many other issues, shouldn't have shocked me, but it still did. And especially did because of very close people in my community, in my chosen family, that have lived with disability with their entire lives, or who have found recently themselves being disabled by an illness or something like that. And also because throughout my life, I've experienced vulnerability because of certain health conditions as well. And the kind of gaslighting that happened, I think, is really rooted to that, is rooted in how our society doesn't want to deal with aging, with mortality, with death, but also how we've projected this idea, again, specifically in the Western world, in the rich countries. And, what also, to kind of backtrack a little bit, what does rich countries mean? Rich countries are actually not just rich naturally by themselves. These are former colonial powers. And what are the poor countries? Well, these are formerly colonized countries from whom the wealth was extracted, right? So that's important to understand because it influences all of the dynamics, including the currently happening vaccine apartheid. But I personally think that ableism is really at the root of all of that. And the only way to really understand how this pandemic has been really affecting people, and if we would have heeded those voices from the very beginning, were the voices of disabled activists and disabled researchers. Because they were saying that from the very beginning. They were ringing those alarm bells from the first cases that started unfolding. And how society has decided that, well, the only ones who die are those with pre-existing conditions, right? The really bizarre irony within all of that, how that's the ism that we reckon with the least, especially when it's compounded intersectionally with other isms, right? So the lived reality is much worse for somebody who's Black, Indigenous, person of color, and disabled, or queer and disabled person, right? Or poor and disabled person. But compared with all the other isms, right? Well, when you're a light-skinned person, you'll say, well, I'm going to always stay light-skinned, right? So if I defend that privilege, is the privilege that I have for life, right? If you're a man and you have this delusional idea that patriarchy somehow actually helps you, which it doesn't, it harms you as well, because it doesn't allow you to fully be yourself. You have to play up to a certain fictional role of manhood. But let's say you have this idea that patriarchy will support you and you think that you will always remain a cis man, you kind of defend that fort because it's your fort. But when it comes to disability, we can become disabled at any given moment in time. Any of us. Nobody has some kind of magic potion that would protect us from that, unless we experience a really sudden death, like a fatal car crash, right? So sooner or later, we will experience disability. Sooner or later, our loved ones will experience disability. And what will just change is the severity or the duration, et cetera, of that. And how throughout this pandemic, we decided to ignore the voices of disabled people and to throw them under the bus and to not give them any mainstream editorials into, right. It's ultimately what led us to the point that we are in today. And the lesson to take out of that is really that in any given situation, when we talk about the future and any choices that we're making, either pandemic strategy, in terms of, vaccine deployment, et cetera, or even pandemic communication strategy, to our climate strategy, to our economic strategy. Who do we have to ask first? And who do we have to choose as our key leadership figures? Is not people that would be harmed the least, but people that would be harmed the most by that any given thing. So hopefully I've kind of woven these threads together.
You did it brilliantly.
And I think, again, it's always, when it comes to issues like the paranoia around critical race theory, or all of the pandemic conspiracies, et cetera, it's always about otherizing and saying that there's this something that does not concern me, that I don't want to understand, that I don't want to learn. And then I have to otherize that. I have to label it. I have to find simple answers and simple excuses that would not implicate my own actions and why things have gone wrong.
So let's talk about Protopia. The term was coined by one of our recent guests, Wired editor or founder, Kevin Kelly. What is it, and how does it help us to think about the future differently?
So the term was coined by Kevin Kelly, who was the founding editor of Wired magazine. In his vision, it was the idea of a better future, but predominantly as supported by incremental technological innovation. And that's very much a vision of his and Stuart Brand's, even if I think Kevin has a broader cultural perspective upon it, and a bit more criticism upon also, technology as a panacea. But ultimately, I think the original framing of Protopia in better futures, not ideal futures, but better futures, and this notion of progress, was predominantly limited to technological solutions. Now, I could have tried to invent another word, but I thought that the word was really, really powerful in its root as well, right? Because it comes from, in the way he coined it, it comes from the word pronoia, which is the opposite of paranoia, which is this feeling that the entire world is rooting for you, which could be delusional too, but I think it's a good feeling to have when we try to think about the future. What really spoke to me is that beginning sort of, Protopia as proactive prototyping. So the difference between that and utopia or dystopia is that utopia and dystopia tends to be some kind of end idea. That's the end destination. Dystopia, everything has gone wrong. There's nothing you can do about it. You might as well just make peace with it and consume while you can't consume, right? Utopia says that, well, it's this perfect idea of the future. Don't you dare question it. Because if you might actually start questioning, the whole house of cards could collapse, right? And both of them generally tend to be top down. And in both of them, generally, people that already are currently in positions of power remain in positions of power. So the way I see utopia and dystopia is not really as a binary or as something, two notions at the opposite side of the spectrum, but really as two sides of the same coin. It's just what do you flip? And I think it's perfectly illustrated when you see movies like Minority Report, that was a surveillance state dystopia, making it into, especially when there was this whole mixed augmented reality craze. And even right now with the metaverse, making into every second VC pitch deck. And movies also like Ready Player One, which is clearly a dystopia we should not be emulating. Right now, that's the whole rage in the metaverse conversation. So it's really amazing how uncritically entertainment's dystopia fetishism feeds into technological hype cycles. And it's very, very problematic. Because not only because both of these visions as end states, this unquestionable perfection as well, that leapfrogs. Actually, the problem with utopia too is that besides its eugenic roots, et cetera, it also leapfrogs everything that we need to be tackling as problems today. And it also leapfrogs trying to reckon with historical trauma and the legacy of historical injustice. What they do too is they also really disengage you. They remove agency from you as a citizen of this planet. It makes you feel that, well, future is being decided somewhere else, and there's no way that you can significantly contribute to that. And so that's why I felt that, especially reading books by even some authors that I really, really appreciate, and I think they've contributed very, very meaningfully to a lot of futures conversation. I believe Naomi Klein kept using and referring to utopia as a frame in This Changes Everything, which was in the LEAP manifesto that she's been working on, which is a really, especially, right now there are newer books on the subject, but at that time it was a very, very important book, right? It spoke about climate change as an umbrella issue to all of the other issues. And so, she was speaking how in order to energize ourselves, especially energize younger generations, we need a positive vision. And so she kept referring to utopia as a vision. And because I look at utopia with its historical legacies of genocide and exclusions and erasures, I felt that we can't keep reutilizing that word, right? And a lot of my peers have also been using dystopia as in their foresight practice. Especially in consulting different firms. Imagine the worst case dystopian scenarios and how things could go wrong, and maybe let's not go there, right? But the problem is that no's are not enough, right? And oftentimes when you imagine these worst case scenarios, when somebody sees, well, we can make some money in there, it becomes a product roadmap. So dystopia as a product roadmap is a real thing. We just kind of have to see, the episode of Black Mirror with a robotic dog and Boston Dynamics robotic dog, and how is already starting to be deployed by militarized police in the United States of America. So I felt that these things are not enough, and we need something new, and we need a really different and engaging vision of the future that is not about end destination, that is not about some kind of fictionalized perfection, but is really about the process of trying to make it better, which requires for you not just to look into the future, but also to re-examine the past, and not in this nostalgic way, because I always stated that nostalgia is actually poison. If you just want to recreate something uncritically that existed before, there's certainly something that you're not examining within that past. So I think it's that duality of not becoming nostalgic, not thinking that technology is a solution, but really thinking, what is the foundation upon which we're building? How do we, if we are to come up with better future solutions, first of all, we have to think of historical inequities. And how do we repair that? How do we make that foundation more healthy? And how, when we are trying to design that, we're not doing it for anybody, right? To design for me, it's a failure from the start, right? You have to design it with. And specifically, you again have to center the most marginalized groups first, and not just center as your target audience or again, somebody that you're going to be doing it for, but center as leaders, as people with greatest expertise of that thing. And then another huge thing I think about Protopia, and something I've been both speaking about and kind of fighting about quite a lot, trying to debunk this idea that a humanist version of the future is the best version of future, and that human-centric design is something positive that we should be kind of embedding and repeating in our system and infrastructure design. I think actually these are really, really bad things. Human-centric design and human-centric vision is the reason why we are in the mess that we are in, right? And I'm not talking about eco-fascism, right? We're not talking about humanity is the virus and there's nothing that we can do right, etc. Because Not everybody has contributed in the same way to the problems that we're living through, right? Yet it's people that have contributed the least that are paying the highest price, right? African continent contributed 3% to the approximately 3% to the greenhouse gas emissions, yet is set to suffer the worst consequences. So unless we recognize that and start with that as a foundation, we're not doing the job. And fundamentally, when you understand what is happening at the bleeding edge of biological sciences, of neuroscience, of medical science, of anything around ecology research, you understand that we as humans, we cannot be well unless all other life is well on this planet. And so we are not what we clearly considered ourselves to be based on a lot of sort of dominant Judeo-Christian mythology, the man to rule upon his dominion, that we on top and everything is just resources that we can exploit. And these words that we use, natural resources, renewable natural resources, et cetera, as if we automatically have the right to take that. This is not at all within indigenous frameworks of either past or the future. So Protopia really looks into life-centric design. How do we design futures centering marginalized people, but also the most marginalized species? And how do we say that we can only be well when we think about all of that and when we embed ourselves in all of that? And that requires considering way more than just technology. And that requires, again, what we spoke about earlier, re-examining how science and technology have been historically biased, have been, when you think about Age of Enlightenment, that so much of the futurism eulogizes and speaks about as a positive thing. I mean, Age of Enlightenment in many ways was, the very opposite of that positive, whatever kind of thinking. I mean, Descartesian thought, the sort of hypermaterial thought was actually a deeply misguided thought, even on a scientific perspective. And that's when things like race pseudoscience was canonized. That's when the worst colonial crimes have happened. So, we can't talk about the future using these very old terminologies and very old frameworks that put humans in the center of it all. And so I think that's a lot, but that's what Protopia is really about. Thinking about all these things and really being in this continuous process and being really, really open to critique and constant contributions rather than say, this is our ivory tower, nobody step in here.
Hi folks, Phil Kirby here, producer of the show. If you're enjoying The Evolving Leader and would like to stay connected with us between episodes, follow us on Twitter at evolving_leader. And please be sure to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. We really appreciate your support. Thanks for listening.
So this is an incredibly rich conversation. I want to leaven it just a little bit with going off attack to the manifesto that Scott quoted from earlier on, and it's something that we'll put a link to in the show notes because everybody should read it. It's very interesting. But the bit I want to get to is a more of a tactical point, which is that's a collaborative effort, as you said. And collaborative efforts are difficult, especially with very clever people, all with, So tell me a little bit about how that works in your world and how you get these very smart people with strong opinions, lightly held, I'm hoping, to be able to arrive at a form of words, at least, that they all, come back.
It's definitely not easy. And here, actually, I want to talk a little bit. I keep going in slightly different directions, but I hope it's interesting enough. I've been arguing for more Protopian future visions in science fiction. And when people ask me, well, can you give me any examples of what Protopian stuff have we seen? And to be very honest, there definitely are examples in literature. But in terms of film, Black Panther was pretty much the first Protopian sci-fi. I feel blessed to have had some conversations with both Ryan, the director, and Hannah, the production designer that created Wakanda. And what's so interesting about that project, right, is that it really, really was that slap in the face of everybody that was saying that, well, if you want to create something dramatic, if you want to tell a really powerful story, you have to tell it in a dystopian context. Like, things have to be all wrong and off and whatever, and that's when it's going to be very dramatic and very interesting, et cetera, which in fact is not the case at all, right? When you think of examples such as Blade Runner 2049, where like the world that we don't feel engaged with, that city of Los Angeles 2049, that if I would invite you, would you like to go and live there? You'd say, no, hell nah. Even if I want to go visit it, it might be for a day or two or a week maximum. But if I ask you, would you like to move to Wakanda?
Yeah.
Would you like to visit Wakanda? I mean, the answer generally would be hell yes. And so what's interesting about that, right, is that when you actually create a world that people fall in love with, when you actually bring together a very diverse group of people. I mean, the people of Wakanda, the characters were all really quite different, with really quite different perspectives on pretty much everything, right? They were all Wakandans, true, but they had very different perspectives. And yet, except for the sort of arch villain, right? But even arch villain had a lot of points that, for example, were very relatable to Nakia's points. What happens is that when it's not a group of people that hate each other, and when the story happens not in a world that is all just desperately depressing, you feel so much more engaged with that narrative. You root for these people to succeed. You care so much more about what happens there. But what happens here there is not easy. I mean, we saw even in that fictional film, right? I mean, there was fighting, there was drama, there were misunderstandings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think the same thing, is in everything that I do. When you try to bring people from really different backgrounds together, there's so much learning. I mean, I try to avoid the fighting. I'm really, I don't deal well with anger and things like that. But there's definitely always a learning curve, right? But what's interesting is when you manage to bring together people from many different cultural backgrounds, gender backgrounds, social backgrounds, generational backgrounds, et cetera, but none of them is a bigot. None of them engages in transphobia, homophobia, ableism, etc. Maybe they don't understand to the same degree all of the issues around trans rights, right? Or refugee rights or disability issues, et cetera. But they all feel like, if I don't know about that thing, but I'm willing to learn, we can all learn from each other. And sometimes that learning can be quite painful because you have to confront. I mean, when I started really diving deep into disability justice issues, I had to confront so much of my own internalized ableism. I had to confront how so many things that I considered to be, I was just weird, and maybe these kids just didn't like me, or maybe this and that, or maybe I was just excluded because of that, or maybe, I was blaming it on the fact that it was just misogyny. I had to realize a lot of that was ableism, and a lot of harm, psychological harm that I caused myself as well, is because, I was conditioned to the ableist perception of the world. And I was blaming myself for something that actually should have been tender with myself, which bled into everything else, into my relationships, my work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I mean, I think when you try to bring together a really diverse group of people, what you have to ensure, once again, is that people that have the most marginalized experience would be safe first, right? Because if you bring a transphobe into a space, naturally you will be excluding trans people. If you bring somebody that is vehemently ableist, you will, like, it's the same thing when we now with the pandemic, right? People are fighting, my body, my choice, appropriating already the feminist language to say that they have the right to not wear the mask, etc., right? But then what you're saying is not that you have the right to do whatever you want with your body, right? If you want to do anything you want with your body, go bungee jumping, go do crazy mountain climbing, go whatever, like anything that you're not going to hurt others. If you want to put your life at risk in very thrilling or very boring kind of ways, as long as you're doing it just to yourself, that's fine. But if you're stepping in a space within which an immunocompromised person could be, that either cannot be vaccinated or for whom vaccine is not going to be strong enough, what you argue is that you have the right to kill, right? And so if I'm bringing together a group of people and I want to make sure that it's disability inclusive, so certainly there will be some people for whom, if they would get sick, they would get marginalized within the medical system. And for whom these health risks are much greater. And if I bring within that space an anti-masker, naturally I will be excluding a person with disabilities. And so that extends to everything with racism, with somebody that is vehemently anti-refugee, etc. So we can bring very different people with very different bases of knowledge and say that we can learn from each other, as long as that whatever we have to say, whatever we express, does not ultimately dehumanize anybody else that is within that space, right? And I think that's the key kind of thing. But it's also about having that, when you know that intentions are good, when you know that people are trying to learn, it's also accepting that somebody to whom a particular issue is really quite new, it will be a learning curve. And as long as they're not malignantly, ignorantly, intentionally trying to cause harm, you can't expect them to go from A to Z in one day. Like, it will take them at least a couple of years of just reading through the books to understand these issues, and let alone starting to have certain confidence and acceptance within a community so they could actually start learning, because you can't just come and throw these questions. As somebody of extreme privilege, you can't just come in and be like, talking to a person whom you have historically oppressed for potentially centuries and just be like, teach me everything about it for free. Do all of this labor. No, you just can't do that. So it's also a long work, but it's also a really, what people don't understand is it's profoundly enriching. It's not a chore. The whole new universe opens up to you. If your reading list is just white male authors, and you start reading non-cis authors and disabled authors and indigenous authors, and authors of very different, Middle Eastern authors, African authors, or following them on Twitter, on Instagram. It's not like you should feel challenged. It's actually a whole new world opens up for you. And if you're just curious enough about it, you will be learning so much that will ultimately make you better as a human being. So we should be excited rather than terrified about that.
I'm very excited by this. I think we've come to the end of our time, unfortunately, and what that makes me feel is deeply frustrated that we've only just opened up this conversation. Monika, would you be willing to come back and continue it fairly shortly so that we could do another part to this?
For sure. Sorry, I feel like I'm because I'm so hyper, because I'm traveling, etc. I'm just going into these really long answers.
It's so rich. It's so rich and so good, honestly. But I think, to John's point, we've just merely scratched the surface, and it would be wonderful to have you back on.
It would be a pleasure. Your questions were beautiful and sensitive, and I think the more we share, the more we learn. little project of love that I have is called Knowledge Exchange, which is it's an internal Twitter of really different, really interesting people. Mine was the trolls and the bigots, and and it's all about, by sharing the knowledge, you also learn, because if everybody shares their knowledge generously, then others will be invited to share their knowledge generously, and then all of a sudden, wow, you've got 200 people that are just teaching each other. So happy to share knowledge at any
thank you.
Whenever
you have opened up Scott and I's minds and hearts to some really profound issues, which I think we need to spend more time on, because the goal of the Evolving Leader is to try and bring progressive ideas that challenge the status quo, that challenge people to think in a really constructive way. And I think you've done that brilliantly today. So let's pause. Wish you well on your travels, and we'll catch up
Absolutely.
with you when you're in your next watering hole.
Thank you so much.
Well, folks, until next time, remember, the world is evolving. Are you?